Okay, class, this is the lecture for the Matsuo Basho unit for our world literature class, namely focusing on their Narrow Road to Oku and translation by Donald Keene. Right. This section, I'm going to take a little bit of time to give us a context of who Basho was, like a little crash course. All right. Obviously, you guys have gone and done some of your own research, so I'm here to hit on the basics and add a little bit of color commentary from the history as we go. But generally speaking, of course, hopefully you've taken the time to do the assignment where I asked you to go do a little bit of research, find out who Basho was and who Donald Keene were, and like what their relationship to poetics was, right? So Basho in general, right? So some big notes that you probably very quickly found. He's probably the most famous historical Japanese poet. He's probably equally one of the most famous poets in the history of literature. I'd argue, not just Eastern literature, but as we've come to understand that not all good literature is written in English, and we've kind of gotten out of a very British and American mindset of such things, we started to realize, hey, wait a minute, other people write very well, and the rest of Europe realized this, and we kind of forgot it when we established the United States as a colony, right? But either way, a lot comes out of it. Basho, very, very famous the world over. Debatably and argued by many to probably be the absolute master of the haiku, right, which we'll talk about, the haibun, which is related, and some other forms. Many people, and kind of historically, we'll talk about some instances, kind of view his work as literally peerless. Like, it is, by default, S+, absolute top best version of this form, and everyone else is aiming for second place, which can be both heartening and respectful of like the heights that someone can get to in a craft, but also kind of frustrating if you're trying to grapple with the form itself, right? Poetry and literature in general are very concerned with the idea of tipping your hat to what's come before you, paying homage and respect. But it's hard for some people to kind of grapple with the idea that like someone can hit a level of an entire craft that cannot be beaten. And it's been a point of plenty of arguing, I assure you. Also, interestingly, and not something that I think in kind of a pop culture sort of way we're super used to running into, right? Basho was very, very well regarded and kind of vaunted in intellectual and literary circles, even when he was alive. That's not something we're kind of used to, right? We're all familiar with the idea of, the poet dies or the artist dies and then their work becomes super famous, right? We think kind of like Van Gogh towards the end of his career and things like that, where just once they go and then people come to understand them and appreciate their work in their absence, which is always very interesting. But Basho got to reap the benefits of his mastery in his lifetime. He had many, many disciples that just gushed at his work and wanted to learn from him as a master, right? Even back then, the greats were attracting students, right? Which is something that continues to this day in how our university system works. He's from the Edo period, which is kind of the last era of traditional Japanese government before we went through something called the Meiji Restoration, which is kind of what moved Japan out of its original kind of developmental setups into what would eventually become a culture that was more primed to interact with Western powers in some senses, but not exclusively. Just one that was kind of more centralized, right? And then kind of the general removal of a lot of the old historical structures that had existed, or lack thereof, right? An enforcement of a centralized authority that came with the Meiji Restoration. So mid-17th century, 1650 something up to close to 1700, right? So I had you guys look at the frog in the pond haiku for the first week, right? Those number of translations. I would be hard-pressed to find anyone who could make a good argument that there is a more famous haiku, right? It's kind of the most emblematic one, especially to people who are not reading vast in language collections of the pieces, but even then in the culture, it just holds an incredibly high place in the societal appreciation of the art, right? It's kind of like the cream of the crop, okay? It spawned a lot of interesting kind of anecdotes that have come out of it historically, some of which were very much around and just towards the end of Basho's life and very close to his death. There is a long history of competitions that if I remember correctly from my checking earlier, thankfully still exists to today in a number of countries, but even specifically back in Japan, that are all competitions done in homage to this, right? In the US, probably the most famous version of a contest like this are the very famous 6-word story competitions that are done in honor of Hemingway's Baby Shoes, little vignette of a story, right? These were haiku competitions about frogs, right? And we'll talk about why frog is such like a very fundamental thing to focus on when we talk about structural stuff for haiku. It has a lot more meaning than just like, hey, culturally, this period of Japan thought frogs were cool. It's not that. They have a lot of symbology to them that is hard to understand without understanding the form. So we'll get to that in the section about haiku in specific, right? There are a lot of structural parts of this that we'll talk about in more detail further on that tie into Buddhist and Shinto thoughts and conceptions about how you appreciate things and things around you, right? That make the haiku very quintessentially Japanese, right? And make some people argue that it doesn't really translate as a form to things like English. I don't think I agree with that. I think you can get there, but there are mechanical parts of a traditional haiku that are just not non-existent essentially in our language. And we'll get to those too. So like I mentioned, Basho did get to reap kind of some of his fame while he was alive, but he started out actually very as a servant, moved up under a samurai, and then became very ingrained in Edo's kind of intellectual scene. Edo being, the old name for Tokyo, right? Before it went through many, many fires and was rebuilt over and over again, it became Tokyo, right? After a while, he decided that academia was bullshit and decided to move to the country and just enjoy existence. You will find a number of interesting names listed for Matsuo Basho that come from a complicated history that Japan has with the idea of names, right? You will find, for example, like Wikipedia suggests that his kind of given name, right, is Matsuo Munafusa, which different, right? Japanese names, obviously, as you're often aware, especially with like Japanese and some other Eastern Asian names, have a different setup for how they're done. It's usually family name and then given name, not the kind of Western approximation of Cat Chitwood or John Smith. It's more like Smith John, right? The family name and then the given name, right? This has a number of interesting kind of connections to things because how the Japanese historically structured their names changed very, very greatly, and there's a large discussion to be had about this, but I'm going to give you a quick crash course that leads to the very fun anecdote of how Basho got his name, right? So before the Meiji Restoration, there were a bunch of different naming systems that went through, right? So in the old ancient times, right? The 500 to 600 to 1,000 area, it was mostly clan names, right? They're from this family, we all connect to each other that way. Over time, names started to come in that were names of status, right? So a king or an emperor would have a name that attached kind of the power and heritage of their office to them. after the Restoration and some of the later emperors, many of these got dropped because it got truly super incredibly long. And when we get to the Kojiki, you can see kind of some of the old naming conventions of honorifics where you'll look at a character's name and they to an English speaker look like they're like 6 or 7 words long, and you're like, well, what is this? It's this gigantic word. And it's like, well, all of these things mean something and would have historically and societally implied certain societal status. So the best I can think of in a much more condensed and simplified way to explain it would be, think of, an attorney deciding to use Esquire as a suffix, or doctor, or MD, PhD, JD, all these other things, right? Where it's just, I have achieved this level of status and the name is attached accordingly, right? It becomes a difference in how we present ourselves, right? Over time, right, the system continued to develop, right? Japan at the time was a nation, was comprised of many smaller, essentially, nations within with different, we go through the shogunate, and then we go through many of the feudal systems with the feudal lords who all have their own regions. Often at that point, kind of the standardized way that was then enforced to assign names to families became kind of geographic for a census-taking reason, right? So perhaps one of the more famous Japanese last names, Yamamoto, means, either people who live at the base of the mountain or people who live in the mountains, right? So regionally, you were in the mountains of this guy's feudal territory. Congratulations, your family's now Yamamoto, as with all the other people in this village, because you are the people living in the mountains, right? This went on for a while, and the system kind of collapsed, right? Borders changed, things get lost, and the government had just stepped in and told people this was their name, and they just left, right? And it doesn't necessarily convince most people to keep them, right? But obviously, given the prevalence of many of the old names, they did stick around, right? Heritage has an import to identity, right? After the collapse, names kind of returned to this very fluid state that was common pre-Meiji Restoration. People's names over the course of their life would change multiple times and in myriad dramatic ways, right? So some examples, right? You would just decide to change your name for any number of things. A large life event, right? Oh, I've grown into adulthood. I've changed my name to reflect the fact that I'm no longer a child, right? I have a neighbor whose name is similar to mine, so I've changed my name so that people don't confuse us when they're trying to look for me in the village. My father and the head of the family has died, and I've become head of the family, so I have taken my father's name, right? So on and so forth. These changes would just keep happening. I've come into service of a new lord and have changed my name to show this change in my identity, right? And a number of other ones, right? There's kind of some note that comes with this, which we're going to notice probably a few times, especially when you were talking about it kind of like a historical patriarchal society, right? And it's something that obviously we still deal with to this day, but history tends to miss out on the feminine perspective of the historical on this. So most of our accounts of how these name changings happened were discussions of men going through these name changes. However, we have hints that it was also happening with women, but there's just less accounts, which is usually just a failure of the historical, right? The historians at the time, very patriarchal society, pretty much just did not care or think that the feminine was worth noting very often. So it makes it hard to track. Was it as common, or was it frowned upon for women to change their names as often, so on and so forth. So it becomes very interesting, right? Basho himself gave himself a few names, right, over his life. His first one was Tosei, which meant very kind of specifically, if I remember correctly, what was his name? Sorry. I lost a note. Let me find it. I should have put this in my notes. Yeah, Basho's original name, Tosei, was Unripe Peach and Blue, right? This is almost kind of a referential pun, I remember this, to a poet who he was particularly inspired by, and we will kind of talk about the historical context of this in a minute. Where did I just put his name? Li Bai, right, whose name essentially meant plum and white, So fruit and color, right, was kind of the pun on. I'm really interested in this artist, so I'm going to name myself in the same sort of setup. But I'm young and not, as I'm not a master like the plum and white, so I'll be an unripe peach. I'm not good enough yet, which is just kind of a funny setup for the name. So he was Tosei. Over time, he gave himself a new name, right? Munefusa was one of the names, or perhaps a name given to him, but his pen name, as we would probably call it, but his most publicly known name was Basho. A basho is a banana tree, like a banana bush. His disciples bought him one. He planted it outside of his hut, right? And he loved it, and he wrote a very famous haiku about hating the weeds growing around it and admiring his banana bush. And he took Basho as his name, right? So he became Matsuo Basho, right? So kind of a fun digression there, but it hints at something that's going to come up again when we talk about the Narrow Road to Oku specifically, right? Namely, Basho had a great fondness for the Chinese masters. Dufu and Li Bai, both very well respected and well read by Basho. He liked them greatly. And if you've ever taken the time to study a bit of mythology, right? Deeper than a very surface level of just like reading the Odyssey or something, right? We notice that literary histories via mythology and the like tend to oftentimes, it's similar geographic regions or regions that would at least bump into each other in a trade or communicative sense, tend to influence each other a lot, right? Kanji, the characters as sounds or words that we have come to know as being kind of fundamentally part of how Japanese is written, come from Chinese characters, right? There's a historical connection to Chinese language. Language and literature are inherently tied into each other, so it makes all the sense in the world that Japan would have interest in, historical Chinese literature. Korea has a similar connection, and then the vice versa is often common where they're speaking back to each other. Mythologically, you see a lot of tales pop up in their cultures that are slightly changed to reflect where they are, but they're a very similar story about a similar deity who might have a slightly different name, right? If we want to look to Western lit as an kind of a equivalency, right? There was an entire school of Greek and Egyptian scholars during the times of ancient Greece that had discussions of the relationship between their gods, because they were both advanced civilizations at different points in their rises and falls. They knew of each other across the Mediterranean, right? Because if the Greeks knew about one side of the Mediterranean, they certainly knew about over by down by the other side. People had traveled and moved around Africa. This kind of connection and knowledge of each other existed. So it became a discussion of, well, if we have, say, Hermes, right? Like, but you say the god of knowledge and writing and so on is Thoth. So like, who's right? And it turned into this entire school of, well, actually, they're all the same god. They just appear differently to different people, and we're actually talking about the same thing. Hermes, Thoth is the same god, right? So people were doing this kind of academic comparison of on a faith level, right? But it also trickled down into the cultural stuff that comes out of myth and into literature and so on and so forth. So Basho was super interested in what Dufu and Li Bai were up to and had been writing. He loved their work. He very much praised them, right? And we will actually get a chance to talk about Dufu later in the semester when we read A Life in Poetry, right, as it's translated. And it'll be interesting to see what kind of shapes we can pull from it that remind us of what we're going to talk about here, right? But that's kind of the general wrap up for Basho himself. The next little section of video that you're going to get is specifically about a quick crash course in things that we can look at in poetry to be able to talk about them.